Thank you very much for that delightful introduction. I wish my father was still alive, and I wish my mother wasn't demented so that she could have heard this. So I realized when I sent the title of this, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, it's also a play on a rather well-known American movie, Clint Eastwood movie, and then I realized that this is something maybe people of a certain age, and if they're tied into Hollywood movies, they might recognize. But so the image on the right here is a very famous scene in the movie when the three people that are regarded as the good, the bad, and the ugly, they're about to shoot each other, and this is sort of the scene. And in some ways, I wish the title were a little bit different, where I could play on the three directors here, which is that I wish that the title had been The Good, the Elegant, and the Bad. And I'll let you decide how I would have had the three pairs of eyes for the good, the elegant, and the bad. All right, so David has already pointed out that I am incapable of pronouncing Fechner correctly, so bear with me. One thing he did not point out, though, was that 2 days and 167 years ago, October 22nd, 1850, Fechner woke up and had an epiphany. And he, for some reason, had been bedridden for a number of years before that, and he had an epiphany which really came out of thinking about Weber's fraction, Weber's law. And from that, he started to think about psychophysics. And over the subsequent years, so he wrote The Elements of Psychophysics in 1860, and his later book on aesthetics in 1876, as David mentioned. There are 3 points out of all of this that I think are completely relevant to what we're doing right now. The first is the claim, the fundamental claim of psychophysics is that there's a systematic relationship between properties of the world and properties of our mind. Right? So psychophysics. This is a fundamental claim that applies to everything we do. The second is that with aesthetics, he thought that there could be an aesthetics from below. And from below, what he meant is that this could be an empirical science and not just one that was determined from first principles, sort of philosophic aesthetics, that there could be an aesthetics from below. And the third point is that he speculated that in the same way that there was an outer psychophysics, which is what he focused on, there had to be an inner psychophysics. That this information had to be mediated through the nervous system, and at some point in the future, there would be a systematic mapping between properties of the nervous system and properties of our psychology. So in some ways, Fechner's claim about inner psychophysics is really what cognitive neuroscience is about, and aesthetics from below is really what empirical aesthetics is about. And so when I talk about neuroaesthetics and particularly about beauty, this really, in some ways, is one coming together of what Fechner's original notions were. Getting better? All right, so the way this talk is going to be structured is that I'm going to talk a little bit about some general organizing slides, organizing for the field. And then I'll talk specifically about beauty, about facial beauty, because that's something we know more about than most other forms of beauty, and talk about the outer psychophysics of facial beauty that we understand, talk a little bit about the inner psychophysics of beauty, and then move on to some other topics that are related to beauty, which is what is the relationship of beauty to other kinds of values. And in doing so, I will actually present a series of different experiments that has never been presented before. And so to some extent, these data are so new that even as of Friday, I was getting analyses from my postdocs about this. So they are not perfectly well digested, but I figured this is the audience to actually help me figure out what it means. And as a teaser, at the very end, the last piece of data that I have will be an exploration of Professor Menninghouse's distancing embracing model, which is we tried to do one little experiment to see if we could get any traction on this in the context of visual imagery. So, all right. So if you think about causal structure, so we're really going back. Fechner is a modern guy compared to him. To the question of causal structure, and this is something out of Aristotle, that one can think of this in 4 ways, which is that there can be an efficient cause, which is what are the triggers by which a certain psychological state or an inference of causation is made. And one can think of the efficient cause as like outer psychophysics. What are the properties of a stimulus that creates a certain environment? One can think of final causes. This is sort of the outcome. One can think of this as applications of aesthetics, or even in a broader scale, think of evolution, of how did we arrive where we are right now to find certain configurations particularly attractive. And then the other two really are what most cognitive neuroscientists are preoccupied by, which is a formal cause, a set of dynamic relations, mental mechanisms that contribute to a certain state, and the material cause, which is what are the properties of the brain, the inner psychophysics of this. And the point about laying these out this way is that they are not collapsible onto each other, right? One cannot study one and assume one knows a lot about the other. And David has written about this in different forms, talking about both the map problem and the mapping problem, how you map from one level to the other. And so I just laid this out here to say that just because you have traction on one doesn't necessarily mean you have complete traction on another. The next thing is to just lay out the domain, which is that you can think of the cognitive neuroscience of aesthetics as distinct from the cognitive neuroscience of art. So there may be questions about art that have nothing to do with aesthetics, and there may be questions of aesthetics that have nothing to do with art. But there is an overlap, and within that, there is presumably a cognitive neuroscience of beauty, which is what I'm going to talk about. And then if you just look at the number of publications, and this was a PubMed search that I did looking at if you search for neuroaesthetics or neuroscience, neuropsychology in art, neuroscience, neuropsychology in beauty, you see this real exponential takeoff of publications. And really around, so this institute I think was started 2012, 13 in that general range, and you can see that you guys are right at the sort of takeoff point, right? So it's really a rather propitious time to be doing this. And then this is a kind of just a broad framework that Ocean Vartanian and I have written about, just as a way to, how do you deconstruct this complex phenomenon of aesthetic experiences in a way that's tractable? And it's worth thinking of sort of the way in which sensory motor systems interact with emotions and valuations that interact with meaning. And that when one is constructing an experiment or designing an experiment, one takes off a little piece of this, but keep in mind that that doesn't mean there's no one experiment that explains everything or can explain everything, because all of these pieces need to be addressed in a comprehensive notion of what it means to have an aesthetic experience. So coming to beauty, there's a rather interesting antecedent to this. So this is Sir Francis Galton, who many of you probably know about, was an absolutely brilliant guy. He was an explorer, he was an anthropologist, a sociologist, a psychologist, a statistician, and made huge amounts of contributions. But one thing that was part of the scientific zeitgeist at the time is that he was also a eugenist. And he thought that one could ascribe certain characteristics based on people's facial features. And in this, so he gave this talk in 1878 to the Anthropological Institute of Great Britain and Ireland, and he was bringing to bear what was cutting-edge technology at the time to try to deal with the social problem. And what this was taking photographs and overlapping them and creating averaged portraits, right? So here's this cutting-edge technology that he's combining. And what he thought was that if he took photographs of criminals and combined them, what would emerge out of that would be the prototypic face of criminality, right? This was the idea. Well, what he finds out, to his surprise, is when he does this, is that this face is really attractive, right? Now, there might be something about being attractive and being a criminal, although that empirically turns out to be questionable, but nonetheless, probably being attractive makes you a better criminal, I would imagine. But that was not the point. This came as a surprise, and this has been replicated many times, which is the fact that if you take, in the laboratory now, if you take a number of images and you combine them digitally and you have an average portrait, that almost invariably the average portrait is more attractive than any individual face that contributes to it. And there's a kind of story, genetic story to be told about this, which is that these kinds of average faces presumably are a reflection of having greater genetic diversity, and that there's a kind of adaptation significance to having that as a display. Now the second, so there are three parameters around facial beauty that seem to be fairly consistent. The second one is symmetry, and symmetry also seems to have a kind of, seems to be an indicator of health. That during the Pleistocene, which is close to about 2 million years, when most people think the contemporary human mind and brain evolved, parasitic infections were a really big deal. And parasites typically will affect plants and animals and mammals and humans in ways that are disfiguring, and disfiguring where symmetry is disrupted. And so this also looks to be a kind of health indicator. And this also has a kind of interesting historic antecedent, which is this beauty micrometer. So this is from the 1930s. And an immigrant to the US, a Polish immigrant named Maximilian Factorowicz, designed this. And this was in the context of Hollywood, where all of a sudden these stars' faces were larger than life on screens, and all these minor flaws became exposed. And so what he thought was, with this beautiful device, which I wonder if you guys have acquired this yet, as the Max-Planck-Institut, you really should. But with this device, he could measure very minor asymmetries and make up for them with the product he sold through his company, which is called Max Factor, right? Named after himself, and that's where the term make-up comes from. It's really trying to make up for minor facial asymmetries that he could assess using this. And then the third factor has to do with sexual dimorphism, and this is making a kind of heteronormative claim here, which is that the effects of estrogen and the effect of testosterone tends to have effects on people's facial features that most people regard as attractive. And so specifically for women, it tends to be big eyes, thin eyebrows, full lips, small noses, and those are all sort of youth indicators, and high cheekbones tends to be an indicator of maturity. So there's this combination. And for men, it tends to be the sort of square jaw, heavy brow, thinner cheeks. And there are sort of nuances about these stories that I'm not going to get into right now. But these also end up being regarded as fitness indicators that are an indicator of health. And some of the arguments around that are a bit complicated, but I'll leave it for now. But I want to make one point, which is when people write about and talk about beauty and saying that there's this evolutionary imperative towards beauty, and this has to do with health, there's one nuance about this that I want to make clear, which is it is not the case, I would argue, it is not the case that individuals are going out and saying, oh, that person looks really healthy, I find them attractive, right? If you think of all of the 16 to 24-year-olds you know, they're not going out and saying, you know, I want to know that person's medical record before I hook up with them, right? This is not what's happening. So here's what I think really is what is happening, which is, imagine this is a kind of an abstract representation. Say there are three kinds of populations. There's red, orange, and green. And that red's like reds, and orange like orange, and green's like green. And they just like whatever they like. They're not worried about health or anything else. This is just what they like. This is the kind of subjective view of beauty is in the eye of the beholder. But if it were the case that it happened that whatever constellation of physical features that red has predisposes red to have one offspring, orange to have two offsprings, and green to have three offsprings, that there is a reproductive advantage to that preference trait pairing for green, which at the individual level is completely arbitrary. If that is true, what happens is, all else being equal, over 10 generations, 98% of this population ends up having a green preference. Right? So if you then go in and test for this preference, you say, well, 98% is pretty high. That's a universal preference. And so the point about this is, when we talk about universality of beauty, this is really an epiphenomenon of something that is not driving behavior at the individual level. Okay. All right. So that's a little bit about the psychophysics and also the final cause, if you think about teleology. But so in terms of the inner psychophysics, what happens when people look at beautiful faces? And especially in the aughts, there were a series of papers that started to look at this. And the general line seems to be that parts of our visual cortex that is sensitive to processing visual faces as an object are activated by more attractive faces, and in concert with parts of the reward system. So this can be parts of the ventral striatum, parts of orbitofrontal cortex, parts of ventromedial prefrontal cortex. Those tend to be the general areas that seems to be the implementation of what it means to to experience something as beautiful, which is that there's part of our visual system, if it's a visual object, that is specific to the domain, combined with our reward systems, our pleasure centers, and that, at least neurally, seems to be what the experience of beauty is. So we were interested in this question of, is the response to beauty automatic? Is it obligatory? All of those experiments that were done earlier had conditions where people are, for example, in a scanner and they're making judgments of beauty. So this is an experiment we did now 7 or 8 years ago, where people are in a scanner and they're looking at a series of faces. And in one condition, they are making an attractiveness judgment condition, a kind of standard. You're looking at things, you say, yes, I think this person is attractive, or no. And in another condition, they're making an identity judgment. So attractiveness is no longer part of the experiment. They're just saying, yes, this is a face I saw before or not. And we can manipulate the distance in face space of how easy or difficult that is. So what we find here is, and we're particularly focused on the visual cortex. So in the left panel at the bottom is these regions in visual cortex that seem to be relatively specialized for processing certain kinds of stimuli. So there is the fusiform face area, which in this is shown in yellow. In the red is the parahippocampus, which seems to be specific to places. And then adjacent to the FFA is an area that has been referred to area LO, right? And so it's called lateral occipital complex. It seems to be specialized for objects in general. So what we find is that when people are looking at these faces, that neural activity in these parts of visual cortex varies parametrically with how attractive the faces are. But it does not, we don't see that activation in the parahippocampal place area. So this is not a generalized visual response. It seems specific to the face area and an adjacent area for objects. And then there are some of these parts of the cortex that are also activated, parts of insula, parts of parietal cortex, parts of medial frontal cortex. But in some ways, the more interesting finding is that when people are making an identity judgment, they're not being asked about beauty. And this is in a completely different session, right? So it's not even in the same session. That the neural response in visual cortex still robustly is sensitive to how attractive the faces are, but not the rest of the cortex. So it's as though this part of our visual cortex has automatic beauty detectors and is just responding all the time when people are seeing attractive faces, regardless of what else they happen to be doing. Now, around the same time, this paper was published in PNAS, where the focus was on the reward systems, and they found something very different. The research strategy was similar to ours, which is that in the non-explicitly attractive judgment task, people were making a judgment of the shape of the face, whether it was wider or longer. So another perceptual task. And what they found was that within the nucleus accumbens, part of the ventral striatum, and in the medial orbifrontal cortex, there was responsiveness to attractive faces, even when they're making the perceptual judgment. So taken together, one might make the inference that what we're seeing is a combination of our visual cortex and reward systems responding together automatically when people are engaged with other kinds of tasks. And so this is a recent experiment that I did with some collaborators in Singapore, which is to ask what's the nature of this automaticity and how far does it go? Do we have this even in our motor systems? Right? When we say someone is attractive, is that really, do we mean this in a very concrete sense, that our motor systems are attracted to people? Very simple experiment. It's a mouse. So basically what happens is people have their mouse at the number 25. These two faces show up, and they just have to move the mouse to whichever number is closer to the target number there. So in this case, it would be 26. And the manipulation is that the faces are either attractive or they're neutral. And in some conditions, the attractive face is closer to the number that is the target. It's an easy task. Everybody is on ceiling at this. It's closer to the target. In other cases, it's on the other side, which we're calling incongruent for this example. And so the dependent measures really is the path of how their hand moves to the target. And so what's the area under the curve of what would be an optimal path, which is a straight movement, and what's the maximal deviation? Very simple dependent measures, a kind of straightforward experiment. And here's what we find, which is that if you look at reaction times, if the attractive face is on the other side, it's the incongruent condition, people take longer. And if you look at their actual trajectories in the incongruent condition, that it's as though their hand, they can't help it. It moves towards the attractive face, even though they know that one is the right answer, right? And that, what you're seeing at the top left is a kind of summation of everybody's movements, right? So attraction is not a metaphor, is what this is telling us. All right. So now, it also turns out there have been at least 2 papers, and not a lot of work on this, which is what's the relationship between beauty and good, right? So the Greeks had these sort of three fundamental values, right? It was beauty, goodness, and truth. And there's probably a whole other line of research linking beauty and truth, right? Many scientists have this deep intuition that the correctness of a theory has to do with its beauty or elegance, but something like that. But setting that aside, there is this notion that beauty is good. And there's a fair amount of social psychology that suggests that attractive people, for example, get more paid, they're hired more easily. Attractive people, if they commit crimes, are given lesser punishments, so on and so forth. And so this is an experiment that was done where people were making judgments of attractiveness, and they were also shown these little cartoons where they had to make a judgment of whether this was a good act, like someone helping an older person across the street, so on and so forth. And the key finding of relevance here is that within orbitofrontal cortex, this general area that is associated with rewards, that there was similar neural activity when people are making judgments of moral acts that were good, as well as when faces are attractive. And at least suggests that there might be a neural basis for this beauty is good stereotype, that there is overlapping neural activity in this part of the brain that then predisposes people to think this is either beautiful or it's good, but there's a kind of leakiness to this value system. So we wanted to look at this in the opposite direction, we were particularly interested, again, in this now in a medical context, of people that have various kinds of facial disfigurements that are actually that plastic surgeons and different kinds of surgeons can try to fix. So these can be scars, these can be face cancers, cleft palate, there are a whole variety of these. And what we did was we collected a series of faces of real people from surgical atlases. And we had to go through many atlases to actually come up with pairs where the two faces were fairly similarly photographed. There weren't, it wasn't the post-surgery with the big smile and so on and so forth, so that they were fairly matched. But these are real people. These are not photoshopped images that we brought in. And so this is a study where people are just asked a series of attributes about the faces. And in this case, it's an across-subject design. So no individual person is seeing the same face, but disfigured and post-surgery, right? So they're only seeing one or the other. They're just making a series of judgments on these attributes. And what we find, which is a little bit depressing, is that these effects are quite robust, that people think that with these minor disfigurements that people are less competent, less intelligent, less hardworking, less extroverted, less trustworthy. So there are all of these attributes being made based on just these minor facial attributes. And if you ask how people feel when they're looking at these faces, when they're looking at the disfigured faces compared to the others, they feel bad and they feel aroused, right? So this seems to be quite robust. So we then, we had a lot of these, and we did a kind of, we did a principal component analysis to see if we could reduce all of these effects that we were finding. And interestingly, when you look at the list of the attributes, it follows along three of the five core personality attributes. Right? So for people who know something about personality theory, it's generally thought there are five attributes: neuroticism, extroversion, openness, agreeableness, conscientiousness. That everybody's personality can be described along these five factors that are relatively orthogonal to each other. And so what this is showing, that people, when they're looking at disfigurement, three of the fundamental five attributes, it's a kind of essentialist notion that from minor disfigurements of the faces, people are making judgments of core personality attributes. So this is something that it turns out that the media in Hollywood is quite sensitive to. So this was published last year in JAMA Dermatology, which is that they list what they have regarded, the American Film Institute, the top 10 heroes and the top 10 villains of all time. And it turns out that there are only two heroes that have minor scars, and 8 of the top 10 villains have all kinds of disfigurement. And it's as though Hollywood uses this as a shorthand where you don't have to talk about someone being a villain, you just show them with some disfigurement, right? You don't have to create as much of a backstory. So continuing with this line, we were interested in this whether, as many of you know, there's a whole array of implicit association kinds of effects that are found for various marginalized groups, depending on the context in which people are marginalized. So we wanted to know, is it the case that with disfigurement, using the same set of stimuli, is there an implicit bias that people are unaware of against disfigurements, right? In the other experiment, at a population level, across subjects, we were able to show this. So now we're looking at individuals. And so for people who maybe don't know this line of work, basically a face is shown up. In this case, they have to respond one way if it's disfigured or one way if it's not. A word is shown up, they have to respond one way if it's a positive word or a negative word, right? And the question is that if in the sequence of when it's a disfigured face and a negative word, if there is an association there, people will respond more quickly than in the other way. And if there's no implicit association, you shouldn't see an effect. So what do we find? First of all, we also have an explicit questionnaire where we ask people, basically, do they have biases against people with disfigurement? And what you find is there's a minor effect among men, no effect in women, or at least in the way that people report this. And this effect in men is fairly consistent, which is that men typically, across all sorts of studies, tend to be more sensitive or more reactive to physical appearance than women, which is not to say that women are not, but just these effects are always more robust in men. When we look at the implicit bias, we find that, again, both men and women now have a clear implicit bias. The effect is stronger among men, but there clearly is a bias with both groups of people. And if you just look at the correlation of people's, at an individual level, their implicit and their explicit bias, there really is no correlation. There are some people who maybe are aware of their own bias, and so they're at either ends, but across a population, it turns out we as a group are very insensitive to these kinds of biases and may or may not believe that we have them. Okay? So this is now a second piece of evidence to say that this sort of disfigurement maybe really has an effect on how we think about people. And then to go back to Hollywood, again, this is a standard trope, right? These are famous Hollywood villains, and you look at how early it starts. The Lion King, right? The villain Lion King is Scar, right? So your 3-year-olds, 4-year-olds, 5-year-olds are being taught this right up front. And even last summer's blockbuster movie, right, Wonder Woman, which was really good in certain ways, right? It was good on gender, most people regard. There was a Middle Eastern man, there was a Native American that all had their little pieces, and yet one of the main villains is someone with facial disfigurement. So we just finished an imaging study where it was the same thing. People are looking at these same set of faces that we had, and they're just making a gender judgment, right? So there's no evaluation. And here there were two specific hypotheses we had going into it. One was this question that we had back from 2009 of this increased neural activity in visual cortex to attractive faces. We were never sure whether this was an effect of attractiveness or is this an effect of salience, right? Because it could be either. And if it's an effect of salience, we would think that these disfigured faces would also have increased neural activity in early visual cortex, whereas it's one of attractiveness, they shouldn't, right? So it's a kind of straightforward prediction. And then I had sort of ideas of where you might also have effects of disfigurement, which turned out were wrong, but I'll tell you what they were, which is I thought, okay, so people get anxious, so maybe you'll have amygdala activation. You could make an argument around disgust, so maybe we'd have insula activation. And I don't actually know that they're wrong, because all we've done now is the whole brain analysis. And here's what we end up finding. That is, in visual cortex, again, ventral visual stream, there is robust, these are really robust findings. The effect of disfigurement is really robust. And so our take on this now is that this part of visual cortex is really responding to salience and not beauty per se. And then if we actually did the experiment where we'd have sort of
beautiful, neutral, disfigured, that we would see an inverted U-shaped curve. And I say that, I want to be clear that I don't want to claim that disfigured is the opposite of beauty. So that I want to be very clear, that's not what I'm trying to claim here, because all of these disfigured faces themselves range in how attractive they are. But the other thing that came as a surprise, or a surprise in the sense that I hadn't thought about this, is if you look in the middle panel, which is that there is all of this deactivation to disfigured faces within parts of medial frontal cortex. And it turns out that this part of the brain is associated with empathy, with people's empathetic states. And Susan Fiske, who is a rather well-known social neuroscientist at Princeton, has made the claim that deactivation in this area is a signature of dehumanization. That when people are dehumanized, whatever reason there might be, that deactivation shows up in this part of the brain. And dehumanization as a construct was just not part of how I'd been thinking about this. But at least it opens up a series of ways to try to think about what's going on when people are making these attributes of people with minor facial disfigurement. Okay, last bit here. This is to try to address Professor Menninghouse's, in a very small way, distancing, embracing idea. And so I do this with some trepidation because I might have the interpretation wrong. But here's my take on it. And the results came back in a way that I was surprised by, but I think are actually more interesting than sort of my naive approach to this. So the claim, I'm going to just say what I think the claim is, and then you can correct me if I get it wrong. The claim is that there are certain situations in which negative emotions or negative attributes of things are incorporated and are embraced, and that for certain kinds of aesthetic experiences, the combination of negative and positive emotions simultaneously is what makes an aesthetic experience more powerful. Right? That's the core claim. And the idea is that under circumstances in which the person who is experiencing these negative emotions feels more in control and safer, they are allowed to incorporate these negative emotions and embrace them. So that's the sort of general claim. And so the question is, what are the mechanisms of distancing? And at least one mechanism among many is that if something is in an art context, that by itself provides a certain kind of distancing. So we use the exact same stimuli. So here the question is, we know that people are making these kinds of negative attributes to disfigured faces. What happens if the same faces are presented in some kind of art context? Right? And there are two possibilities. The obvious possibility, which is what I thought was the obvious, is the toxicity of reaction to these faces will be attenuated, right? They'll be controlled. But there's another possibility, which is what ends up being true, which I'll get into. So here's the same set of faces. What we did was we did this filter on all of them so that they looked like they were paintings of the same people. Right? And then we did this behavioral study with the question of, under this condition, so we are at least exploring the possibility with these same stimuli, if they are shown in very clearly a painting way, that produces distancing. Now remember, photographs is already at least one step distance. It's two-dimensional, it's not the same as seeing a person there. So we don't know if the dose here is sufficient going from a photograph to a painting rendering, so we didn't know that to begin with. But if it were the case, what happens to the person viewing these? And what happens to these kinds of attributes? Is there an interaction between the photographs and the paintings? So that's the basic question. So the first thing to point out is that when we get people's self-assessments, that we replicate what we had seen before, that people feel very aroused when they are seeing photographs of people who are disfigured. But there is no real difference in arousal when they're looking at these painting versions of whether someone is disfigured or not. right? So it at least suggests that if arousal, and valence, it's less robust than arousal, but the same thing, which is that the valence that people, the negative valence that people feel, the difference from the photographs of disfigured and non-disfigured, that difference for the paintings is attenuated, right? So I would argue that at least our manipulation of showing this as a painting had the effect that you want, which is people are less aroused and they don't feel as bad as they did, right? So this is a kind of creation of a safer environment. So what ends up happening with these attributes? So the first thing is the kind of principal component structure of response to both photographs and paintings ends up being exactly the same, right? So people are viewing these in a similar enough way. And the asterisk on this bar graph, which is particularly for what ends up being, we think, extroversion and agreeableness, is where there is an interaction of the difference, significant interaction of the difference depending on the nature of the stimuli. And so this is what we end up finding, which is there's a small effect of extroversion, which is an attenuation. But in some ways, the more interesting finding to me is this on the attribute of agreeableness. When people are looking at paintings, they are more likely to say that these are disagreeable people in the context of paintings. And so to me, what this suggests that if you look at the combination of people willing to acknowledge these feelings to these kinds of stimuli while they are not aroused and not feeling bad, is a particular combination where it suggests that in an aesthetic context, one of the effects of this may be that it permits us to feel things that we normally want to suppress. And that might be part of why in their model, the idea is that the allowing these feelings to take on their full force and embracing them because people are not aroused and are not feeling badly is what gives power to these aesthetic experiences. So that's sort of, again, it was not how I thought it would go, but it's sort of where I think we're landing on this. So anyway, to summarize this, talked about Fechner and talked about inner and outer psychophysics. I wanted to communicate this idea that our response to beauty, particularly facial beauty, is automatic, that along with that comes a bunch of stuff, which is that all these negative attributes can be positive or negative attributes that have nothing to do with what a person is like, is superimposed on people just on how they look, and that maybe this, when these same things are placed in an explicitly artistic context, that the way our emotions are regulated is altered, and presumably in sometimes in very powerful ways. Thanks.
Thank you, Anjan, for a wonderful summary of the work. We have time for some questions before we retire to Wein and Brezen. Who has the first? Okay, I'll do the honors of walking around. Okay.
Thanks, Anjan, for this great talk. Just a question about the last result. I'm wondering, what are your thoughts about the potential role that by making something into a piece of art, you are introducing into the mind of the viewer the potential intentions of the artist? Just like a Hollywood movie producer might put a scar on an actor to signify that they are bad, a person observing a painting with a facial disfigurement might think that they're more disagreeable because perhaps there's no other reason to put that in the painting unless, to assign that or something like that.
Yeah, so it's a good question. I don't know the answer to that, obviously. These are data we just got, literally in the last week, where we're still analyzing it. I think it may very well be the case that we are primed because of all of this media, right? To say, okay, this is a shorthand to say this is someone who, this is a, to quote our fearless leader, this is a bad hombre, right? But the point, for me, the critical piece is that the observer doesn't feel more aroused when they're looking at the painting, but they still recognize it because the factor structure seems, or the principal component structure seems very similar, whether it's paintings or photographs. So, but the causal direction is unclear at this point.
Thank you very much, Anjan, for this great talk. I just have a quick remark regarding your last slide.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we have run 2 experiments of the very same nature, and we simply collected other ratings on top of those you have collected. So we also found if we present, say, for instance, some disgusting matter as a photograph of a real object or of some art photography, then the ugliness ratings, the beauty ratings, all these things stay the same, including arousal. But if you also ask how positive did you feel after seeing it and how negative did you feel? So we essentially found just on this effect measure a strong positivity effect for the art framing. Other than that, we have the same data essentially, so they are not really different. Certainly I appreciate your interpretation, it's a difficult issue. You know, my other point is of a more elaborate nature, perhaps. You keep speaking of beauty, and I just want to highlight that. So, if you label these faces as beautiful, it's important to say that's some kind of averageness effect. And what you see for disfigurement is a strong effect of negative deviation from averageness in the direction of disfigurement. I mean, most of the things that are around in the media are of a completely different nature. They insinuate that we have a very strong positive effect of beauty for those who are more beautiful than the average face, which go into the direction of the perfect tens or so. And that is, I mean, I think it's important to highlight that much research has found adverse effects for, I mean, individual beauty that passes beyond a specific threshold. Both for men and women, specifically even more so for women, that then the attribution of negative characteristics of character, increase, and they increase the more beautiful the respective person becomes. So the striking beauties then are attributed higher degrees of neuroticity, and all these things. I personally believe it's important to look into these clear adverse effects of beauty, which are not in line with the classical stereotype. I just want to mention that because this story, to some extent, certainly is bewildering. I mean, where you feel like, wow, I mean, that is against everything morality and religion tells us, right? But it's to some extent, it's not the whole story. That's what I wanted simply to say.
Yeah, so I certainly wouldn't, I think, I don't want it to be the whole story, otherwise there'd be no grant to write about this. But to your point, as we were talking yesterday, I've been reading and looking at Umberto Eco's book on ugliness, and he makes this point and actually refers to the book you pointed me to on the is it Rosencrantz, I think? Right. And makes the point that Rosencrantz initially made a link, start with ugliness and moral depravity, but then deconstructs this, right? And deconstructs this and says there are a whole series of kinds of ways in which what we call ugly can vary, of which deformity is one, but there are a whole series of these. And at least looking through the examples that Eco has in this book of paintings over the years, a lot of it seems political, that sort of certain marginalized classes are then regarded as ugly. So again, the causal direction of this is not always clear. We have not done anything with sort of supermodels and at that end of beauty, and whether there is a kind of, I think as you're suggesting, there's a fall off in this sort of general positive attributes that tips over.
I hesitate to ask, but can we talk about nature and nurture for a minute? If yes, I'd like to pick up the strong association between ugliness and morally bad, whatever. Because in the end, you mentioned it and you had a slide, we are taught this association for ages. Now, movies, paintings all make that point and association because they have no other way of showing that somebody is bad. They have to show it visually. And the brains you put into your scanner are brains of persons that have gone through a socialization in that way of seeing things and looking to people. So my question basically would be, do we have any chance, or do you see any possibility to, in the end, decide if that is a question or a matter of nature or nurture, or both, or whatever?
Yeah. So I like many of these kinds of questions, I don't know that it's an either or, right? And so the kind of evolutionary argument would be that these disfigurements, it's sort of the reverse argument of the attractiveness, that these are markers of health. And so our brains evolved to respond automatically to them. Having said that, I would like to point out that, that when people make these evolutionary adaptation claims of reflexive reactions, there is no reason to think that we are enslaved to those reactions, right? So this Google memo that many of you know that, blew up the internet, was taken down on its evolutionary claims. But independent of that, it doesn't matter. And I'll give you an example that makes this clear, which is that there's an evolutionary argument to say that during the Pleistocene, when nutrition was a problem, our brains evolved to crave sweet and fat, right? This seems plausible. And now we are surrounded by sweet and fat. I mean, you can't walk 10 feet without encountering something that's sweet and something that has fat in it, right? And so we have an obesity problem, right? Certainly in the US, but in most developed countries and developing countries. So there are these predispositions, but it's not the case that we have this huge frontal cortex that allows us not to react to things that we might have a predisposition. So this is where I think education can both help or hurt, right? It can either exaggerate these effects or it can attenuate them over time. And so particularly with issues around racial bias, there are these ways of trying to mitigate that. But I would think disfigurement would fall in the same category of things where you can mitigate that through nurture. And exactly how to do that is less clear to me. But
thanks, Anjan, for your talk. My question goes back to the Hollywood villains. And I would be interested, what is your take on the fact that very often people are more fascinated with the villains who have scars, and like the Joker, for instance, they have more fascination with this character than the boring Batman?
I mean, it could be. So obviously anything I say is pure speculation here. But it might be the case that this is a way, first of all, it's a quick shorthand, right? You don't have to develop the character. As soon as the person comes on the screen, you're already primed to say, okay, this is a bad man, as opposed to having some backstory that, they did these horrible things in the past, right? So there's an immediate, you start at a different level. And it might be the case that what we're finding for this agreeableness, given the context of a movie, right, that the Joker is not out by my car when I leave the movie theater, right? I can feel safe, that I can really experience the horror of him in a way that otherwise I might have all sorts of reasons to try to suppress that.
Thank you also very much. I was very impressed by your speech. I'm a child psychotherapist and very interested in all this psychoneurology. And did I understand you right? That's my question. That you say, in a sense, it's an evolutionary instinctual reaction to choose the beauty in a sense that you choose the strong and like it more and give all the positive attributes to this to be able to choose it for that mankind is going on. It is a very a reaction without you showed in the first experiment, you can't avoid it to have this reaction. And to avoid it, you have to think and to correct your reaction. And I had two associations. When I was a young girl, I didn't like to do the things who are easy, and for this I choose men who are not so attractive, because I was interested. This was the one, because the other I thought it's too easy to choose an attractive man. I was then interested in men who were not so attractive, because I wanted to experience how they think, how they are, and I thought then I really will know something about them, because we are not dealing with beautiness, yes? This was one association, I remembered this, and the other was my husband told me when he was a young man and he was in a home for students, and there was the discussion, how do you choose the students who could live with you? And there were many very complicated issues you should ask, and he said, no, I will choose the beautiful. That's my item. And I had now yes, it's right, it's easy, yes? You don't have to think so much and to ask so much. Yeah.
So I have a couple of comments to that. First, before I say anything, is your husband in the audience? Is your husband in the audience?
Is your husband in the audience?
No.
Okay. So,
He would appreciate it.
right.
We laughed about his idea.
Yeah. So it turns out empirically what you're saying works across populations, and this has been looked at over something on the order of more than 25 different cultures, that if you ask men and women what are the attributes of their partner or someone they're attracted to, you list them. With men on a population level across all of these cultures, attractiveness is always at the top. With women, it's always in the top 5, but not necessarily in the top. And there are other things that show up, like intelligence or power or money. You know, there are a whole series of these kinds of things. So I think that turns out empirically across multiple cultures to be true. The other, the one speculation that I'd like to put out there, and it's a pure speculation, which is that all of these evolutionary arguments are predicated on an environment in which there were certain conditions that predisposed to reproductive success, right? Yeah. Which no longer applies now, right? They no longer apply now for the following reasons. We have medicine, people have children later, you can have in vitro fertilization, you can have C-sections. There are all these things that the original reasons, for most developed countries, people don't die of parasites anymore, right? So all of the filters for reproductive success that was true for almost 2 million years is just not true anymore. But the question is, what happens to the instinct over time? Because in those situations, what happens is that there is a drift. There's a drift towards more variability. And now what the time sequence or the time span of that is unclear, but my prediction is that all of these things that I'm talking about as universal attributes of facial beauty will become less and less universal over time. Now, whether that over time means 100 years, 500 years, I don't know, but yeah.
Because
it's not relevant anymore, right?
Thank you.
Thank you for this really amazing and inspiring talk. I just want to follow up on the idea that beauty creates attractiveness and trustworthiness and so on. So is there also a relationship with social hierarchy? Because if there is one, then your argument that it may actually go away, it may not necessarily be true, right? Because we may be selecting based on that attribute, right? For power and so on.
So I want to make sure I understand the argument that if we're selecting for power.
First of all, I'm actually asking whether there's a relationship between beauty and social hierarchy. Because in a way, it's implied by attractiveness and trustworthiness and so on, right? That's how we choose our politicians and so on and so forth.
So there is a little bit, it's a little bit of a mixed bag. So as I suggested, again, this is a lot of social psychology, that attractive people get certain advantages in life. Turns out that teachers will give attractive students better grades unless they're standardized tests, right? So there are a million little ways in which people get advantages. One of my favorite experiments around this was people had what appears to be a college application, right? And in the college application is a photograph, right? So the exact same thing. And these are distributed, so they're stamped envelopes that are not closed. And these are distributed in an airport, right? So random people pick them up, they look at this, and they say, oh, this is important, it should be mailed, right? If you're a decent person, one says, oh, this is important, it should be mailed, and you just mail it. It's all stamped, you have nothing to do. Well, it turns out if the exact same application, if the face on it is attractive, people are much more likely to mail it, right? So I just say that there are these little things that pervade our life in a way that most of us, most of the time, are just blind to. So it probably is the case that broadly there is a kind of hierarchy. Now, there is a way in which this promotes a social hierarchy. There are these outlier cases that are also quite interesting, which is that in the Army, right, in the US Army, there's one particularly intriguing study that looks at portraits of cadets when they enter the Army. So this is all men now. And the idea is that these heavily testosterone faces are the ones that are going to go on to become, generals and all of this sort of stuff. It turns out on a population level that you can look at the freshman books of entering students, and there is some predictive value of who's going to ascend through the military. But if someone has those attributes, and turns out it's a false signal that they're not really a leader, they're not macho and all of this kind of stuff, they are really punished. They're really punished than just like the neutral guys.
Maybe I can take one turn. I wonder two things. One is, how does this generalize? I mean, this is a very, your talk is very facocentric, which is good because it lends itself to making this kind of argument. But should this implicit association and desire to move towards beauty scale up to objects? I mean, so if you give people 1,000 objects to rate, chairs and computers and all kinds of other things, coffee cups, and you deform them by breaking them, do you get the same thing? I mean, is it a generic property, or is it informed by being a natural kind, like a face? That should be easy enough to do, at least, if not to answer.
Yeah, so the deformation question is intriguing. I'm not sure about that. But the beauty with consumer objects, I think, is clear, right? So, for example, most people historically, like here we have this, I have a Mac. People are willing to put their money, pay a premium for something that is regarded as an aesthetically pleasing object compared to another object that does exactly the same thing, right? And I think it's demonstrable that the same mug that gets coffee, from your coffee pot to your mouth, if it's beautiful, people are willing to pay more. So I think there is an added value that's not just utilitarian to beautiful objects, right? I would submit that as true, without having done the experiments. Now, once you get into, Umberto Eco talks about also there's a kind of fascination with the disfigured, which is a whole other thing that, I don't have any traction about that. And is there a way that objects can tip over where they are so ugly that, they become appealing unto themselves? I don't know.
So my perceptual question, if it's so fundamental a process, is it like an early filter? I mean,
Yeah.
that is to say, is it not possible to see anything without giving an immediate judgment? So every single thing
Right.
you see, every little micro decision
Yeah.
you make after every saccadic eye movement, you evaluate it and you give it, let's say, an aesthetic stamp.
Right. Well, I would like to believe that to be true, but whether it is, I don't know. I mean, like our thing, like this limb, right? All you're going is from one point to the other. Again, it's in the facocentric universe, right? But the fact that it would have an effect, is pretty amazing. Whether it is the case that we are, just talk about environments, right? People care about what's in their environment, what you hang up on your walls, what people are surrounded by. The idea that there is a kind of a sense of even well-being in the context of environments that are aesthetically pleasing. I think we're doing some work in my lab trying to get at that. But I think, again, does this generalize to every single thing? I don't know, but does it generalize to a lot? My intuition is yes.
Do we have any more? Benford.
So I obviously keep thinking about your study. And one thing is, obviously, I also feel there's something about facialness which doesn't generalize to other objects, because that's such a intense response. But in terms of being transformed through the art context, you would need to add something, specifically narrative. Now look at the villains in Hollywood movies. If you take them away from the movie, you would get a response that people enjoy them less. So that's what I mean. So in this case, they are functional for the overall enjoyment of the movie. Right. And that may simply not be the case if you have no way, to add any narrative to simply a disfigured face, presented without any context of, where you can create a background story or something like it. If you could, then I would suggest results might be different, even in the absence of taking positive and negative effect values.
Yeah, I think that's certainly possible. What I was trying to get at was this is just a small piece of your idea. And the small piece is that even with something so simple, the art context has an effect, right? And it has, to me, an intriguing effect, which is rather than, I thought it would just attenuate the reaction. In fact, it increases the disagreeableness in the context of not being aroused, right? So that suggests that if you now had a narrative around that, it could end up being a pleasurable experience. We didn't ask the question that you guys asked. So it's just one piece in a chain of sequences that I think this is trying to get at.
Yes. You two will be the last that stand between us and wine. So you were first.
Thank you for that speech. I'm a bit shy to ask a question because I'm an artist and not a neuroscientist. But I have a bit of a problem with calling the photoshopped photo an artwork, because it's actually a very particular filter, and it's a very particular effect of heightening saturation, contrast, hardening the edges, and bringing out greens and reds. And I think that should be maybe, I don't know what the wording is in your tests, but I think it has to not be called art or art context, or it has to be specified what the filter is, because I could imagine that would have very different results depending on the filter, or if it's actually a painting made with pigments by hand or by computer. Thank you.
Yeah, so I take your point. What we decided was to take the same filter across all the images, right? So, and it's a very clear filter, and that will report what that filter is. And we didn't know that this was going to work, right? This was a first attempt at doing this. What gave us some degree of confidence that as an experimental manipulation this might work is that when we looked at the factor structure of people's responses to both kinds of images, that they were very similar, right? So they worked in the sense that people viewed these manipulated images in broadly the same way that they viewed the photographs. And then there were differences in how they felt about it and differences in what attributes they gave to it. Now, like for example, there's a Van Gogh filter, right, that we could do. Whether it would generalize to that, I don't know. We could have real artists. So actually at Penn, they did this with children that had deformities. And there's a particular portrait studio, like a painting school that specializes in portraits, where they had artists paint the faces of these little children with various kinds of disfigurement. And they have a publicity video of this, which is extremely powerful, that these little kids, 5, 10, 12, express how moved they are by having to sit for a portrait painting, that all of a sudden, instead of being sort of hiding themselves, that they are actually worthy of this kind of study and that a painter would be willing to paint them. So that's not an answer to your question other than to say if you had a real painter or a group of painters that were consistent in style, we could do this sort of experiment with real people. There's a version of that. But this is, look, everything that's done in a lab is going to be artificial to some extent, right? So
where was there you are.
Sorry. First of all, thanks for the talk. I'm not surprised that people tend to attribute a pleasant aesthetic impression with moral truth, whatever. I don't know which philosopher it was, but the idea that I got from philosophy aesthetic lessons was that when you have a musical taste, you sort of feel like this is an absolute truth. For example, if you like classical music and you hate rock, you wouldn't claim that anybody who likes classical music is morally correct, and everybody who likes rock music is insane, but it is your feeling that you are correct, that the music taste that you have is the right taste. And in that vein, I'm not very surprised. Of course, you could say this is incorrect, but if you would agree to this notion, then it's not surprising to me that people apply the same to faces. People who look nice, they attribute the most positive character traits to them. Yeah, and if I may add, the fascination with the ugly, I think it's the author is Joseph Campbell, who wrote The Hero with 1,000 Faces. He studied the mythology of stories all around the world, and he came to the conclusion that the hero's journey, the story behind all stories, is basically about our inner struggle. So the villain is basically a symbol for our own bad sides. Yeah. Okay.
The enemy within, we all struggle.
So you have to say something wise about beauty, truth, and morality as a final word. But we thank you very much, Anjan, for coming, for your lecture, for answering, and thank you very much for coming. We all invite you directly across the way for Wein, Brezen, Butterbrezen, questions, conversations, provocations, and thank you, Anjan.
Okay.